Welcome to the inaugural Face to Face. Why are we doing this? Because somewhere between the snarky tweets and endless keyboard warrior battles, the actual experts got drowned out by memes and caps lock. And let's be honest, if solving the planet's biggest energy challenges could be done with emojis, we'd all be driving solar powered Teslas to Mars by now. At Energy News Biz, we believe in something radical, putting real experts in the same virtual room, face to face, without hiding behind a screen or suspiciously egg-shaped profile picture. This isn't about picking sides, it's about transparency, big questions, and maybe a few laughs along the way. So, ladies and gentlemen, academics, and anyone who stumbled in here thinking this was a cooking show, welcome. I'm Arnes Biogradlia, your host, moderator, and occasional referee for what promises to be a rousing brainy brawl about the future of our planet, or as I like to call it, two Aussies walk in a Zoom call. Today, we're tackling some hefty questions about the energy transition. Like, do we have enough minerals to save the planet, or should we all be hoarding copper wiring from abandoned buildings? Fun, right? But don't worry, it's not just me rambling on the stage. I've got a backup. Joining me are the two of the sharpest minds in the business, who also happen to be Australian expats. First, we have Dr. Gavin Mudd. He's an expert in sustainable mining and one of a few people who can make you care about what's under the ground without burying you in jargon. Tuning in from the UK, the land of tea and polite nodding, Gavin Mudd. Gavin, have they knighted you already, or is that pending?
I'm working on it.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And on the other side, we've got Associate Professor Simon Michoud, a man so passionate about resource analysis he moved to Finland, where the ice is thick, the air is cold, and the baits are even colder. Simon, thanks for taking a break from your sauna to join us.
Hello, guys.
So here's the deal. We're here to talk about big ideas and even bigger questions. Are we running out of resources? Can we actually hit these net zero goals? Or are they just wishful thinking written on the back of a napkin? And what about recycling? Savior or overhyped? It's a lot to unpack. My role today is simple. I'll tee up a topic, step back, and let Simon and Gavin duke it out with words. Think of me as a Switzerland of this debate. Neutral, but still slightly playful.
And Rich.
If things get too heated, I'll step in with a joke to diffuse the situation, but mostly I'm here to keep things moving and make sure we all leave with our dignity and at least one new fact to annoy our friends with. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
Now, let me set the stage with a few guiding principles for our speakers today. This is more than just a conversation. It's an opportunity to inspire, to educate, and to lead by example. If we, as informed and educated individuals, cannot engage constructively, how can we expect others to follow suit? The world is watching. It's on us to set the tone. Gentlemen, here are the rules. Rule 1, play fair. No low blows, no personal attacks, and no underhanded tactics. Challenge ideas, not individuals. This is a dialogue of minds, not egos. Rule 2, respect the exchange. Speak with purpose, listen with intent, and respond thoughtfully. Let's raise the standard, not lower it to noise. Rule 3, stick to the facts. Bring evidence. No shortcuts with misinformation. Bring solutions and insights. In this space, the truth must always prevail. So, as we begin, let's commit to engaging with integrity, vision, and purpose. The stakes couldn't be higher, and together we can make this moment count. Let's lead by example. It's showtime.
It's showtime!
All right, let's jump right into the first big question. Are we truly facing a mineral shortage, or can we mine and recycle our way out of this mess? Gavin, Simon, let's hear it. And remember, no throwing academic shade. For the start, you have 5 minutes each for your slides to establish the case. Then we're going for exchange. Simon, you may start.
Okay, so are you seeing my sharing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So here's my position. The task to phase out fossil fuels is upon us, and it needs to be actioned now, not just talked about. The task is much larger than we thought. All conventional renewable technologies work on a small scale, but there are gaps in the thinking regarding to scale up and operation. Most renewable tech is not as flexible as fossil fuels. Much of the existing renewable tech being organised and deployed in context of still needing support from fossil fuels in some form. Stationary power storage to act as buffer for wind and solar electricity generation is much larger than first thought. The technology to store such a vast amount of electricity for such a long time does not yet exist. And most studies that examine this topic are either economic market predictions or focus on carbon emissions. The physical number of technology units doesn't seem to be part of the thinking done. The quantity of metals was estimated in a very crude calculation that doesn't include everything. So many studies that do examine metal demand miss important details. For example, batteries and power storage are not looked at, but solar panels and wind turbines are. Supply quantity of raw materials in context of where we get them from and how do we turn them into useful stuff is not part of public thinking beyond the market will fix it. Substitutions are certainly possible in many cases, but not all, brackets, yet. Discussion about production of technology with substituted metals often falls back on wake me when the market tells us to do this. Supply of such a large quantity of metals in such a small time far exceeds what is practical for the mining industry for the existing plan as we think we're going to do it. The true bottleneck, though, is smelting and refining and manufacture. Chinese capacity, as large as it is still not enough to deliver the number of units that we think we need in the next 25 years. Also, being dependent on China for something so important is not that smart. Stated mineral reserves and estimated resources are not enough in their current form. Yes, they are growing, but what's been recorded at the moment is not enough. So the shortfall is significant, and my position is not that we're running out of minerals, but we should do something else. We should plan to do something else that needs different technology and different minerals, and that is me.
Thank you, Simon. Oh, that was 2.5 minutes. Do you want anything to add?
Well, there's lots I could add, but I'll give the floor to Gavin.
Great. Gavin?
No worries. Thank you. It's first of all, I just want to, I suppose, acknowledge where my focus is really on the resource questions. And I guess many years ago, I was invited to Yale to visit Tom Gradle on a workshop looking at a lot of the byproduct metals, then being called critical metals. Now, Tom had the same concern. Do we have enough of the resources to be able to build out the level of whether it's solar panels, wind turbines, and other technologies, electric vehicles, and so on, to make an energy transition possible to deal with climate change? And the problem was that there's, I guess, a lack of data for many of these. Now, since then, I guess I've been now both collaborating with Tom and many others around the world on these sorts of questions. So these views are my own. They're certainly not that of my organization. So they're my own personal views based on my own experience and academic publishing and so on. So I'm happy to make these slides available. And if people want to then follow the links, they're most welcome. But certainly, I guess we've been doing a lot of work in this space. One thing I just want to be really clear about, and Simon sort of touched on the terms here, is when we're dealing with mining, we do need to be very specific about terms such as reserves versus resources. And this is often poorly understood outside sort of the mining industry itself. But they are specific, and it's the same when we talk about petroleum reserves or things like that. They have specific meanings for both corporate and regulatory sort of purposes. Now, reserves are short term. They're assessed, they're expected to be profitable to mine. And so if you have a project and you've got reserves, then you should be able to make some money out of that mine. And by the nature of a reserve, it means it's always short term. Mining companies only plan out for the next 5 to 10 years because whether it's commodity fluctuations in prices or demand cycles, the boom bust cycles, mining companies don't want to invest more money than they need to for the 5 to 10 years sort of business planning. So whenever we look at reserves, of course, they're going to look like 5 to 10 years because that's the nature of the way the industry works. When we look at resources, we talk about, say, mineral resources, and that's a deposit that's geologically well known typically. It's of a grade and sort of quality that's generally expected to be economic soon. Maybe now, but certainly it's expected to be economic in the near future. And so that may be somewhere between 10 to 20 years or 40 years, somewhere within that time frame. But most of the work we've done when we've looked at resources, you're more looking at sort of the 25 sort of year mark is sort of the time frame there. But they are very dynamic and they change because they are economic concepts. They are not geological concepts. And that's one of the things that often gets mixed up. The only group that actually compiles global reserves and reports them publicly is the US Geological Survey. And previously before that, it was the US Bureau of Mines. And trying to get equivalence on reserves across multiple countries around the world that have different systems for doing that is difficult. So we always have to use their data, I guess, with a bit of understanding that it's complex and difficult, but and as we'll see, so you can see some orders of magnitude there that it's not too far off. Now, one of the things I guess I've done in my sort of work is look, are we running out of resources? So we've gone through and done global studies on adding up all of the individual deposits, both reserves and then the resources, and then working out what's cumulative production over time. And as we can see, when we look at that, and this is, the devil's in the detail, but the blue area is basically cumulative production over time. And virtually every one of these elements is still increasing over time. Right? The yellow is the USGS reported reserves. And generally for a lot, there's still a lot of reserves left. Some, not as much. But we've been able to maintain that 5 to 10 years sort of reserves at the very least, or sometimes more. And sometimes they go down, sometimes that ratio goes up. The USGS also used to report what they called reserves-based, which is basically equivalent to resources. And so that gives you an extent, I guess, a view of what else is out there that will eventually become economic. Now, of these, mercury is about the only one that's starting to approach a Hubbert-style peak curve and starting to flatten. And that's because it's toxic and we really don't want to use mercury. So we've been removing it from a lot of our industry and use. So again, there is data out there on these questions. One of the things I guess I've done, and I've published across a lot of the periodic table, right? Yes, happy to make these slides available.
Yes.
But when we've done our global studies and we've gone in at a very granular level and found data for each reported deposit as best we can, and then added that up globally across countries and everything else, so we can get actual reserves estimates according to the mining companies, and then compare that with USGS reserves. And there can be differences, and sometimes there's reason for those differences. But also when you're looking at long-term sort of cumulative production, the historical data sets, you get a sense. You can see copper, we've got as much sitting in reserves as we've already mined. Now, when you look at the IEA scenarios, that's the International Energy Agency, and that's just one scenario out there that do include batteries.
So,
We're looking at about 915 million tonnes of copper. So that's well within our reserve estimates. Right? And also, when we look at our resources that we've provided, I would expect, based on my experience, that number would go up if I went back and redid that study. So almost there. So we can see that we've got an abundance of resources, and we can see the same things for the other elements here as well. So when we come down to it, the question is not do we have the resources, it's how do we make sure we get the supply there. And making sure that we actually meet our net zero targets. So really the questions are, yes, ore grades are declining. That means impacts are going up. If we have more tailings, that means greater risks, more waste rock, especially if we continue the open cut. But also, more processing means more energy, more water, more carbon footprint. We need to think about our governance models. That's a very big issue, especially as a lot of mining has been moving increasingly across to developing countries and parts of Africa and South America and so on. What that means in terms of social risk. We don't have a great track record of mine rehabilitation across the global industry. And again, as Simon was alluding to as well, the geopolitics, who owns and controls the different minerals and those supply chains. Now, I think there are real solutions available. We know many of them. We don't necessarily know everything. And I think one of the things I'd always point out, when we started rolling out the automobile back well over a century ago, we didn't have all the solutions. We didn't have all the infrastructure in place. Things were evolving over time as we realized we had a problem to solve, whether it was safety with seatbelts, whether it was road design, all sorts of things. So I think what we can do is we can say, yes, we know how to do mining better. We know how to decarbonize mining. I think there's a lot of progress in that. And I think that's some of the ways we can really help address especially the CO2 and energy side of things. But also in terms of dealing with social risk, why aren't we setting up a global mining legacy fund that allows us to go and clean up some of these old poor mines, which is where a lot of social concern comes from about mining projects. And so to deal with that, I think we need a lot of radical transparency. So I think that's the way we can move forward. And I'm certainly very confident and very optimistic that we can.
Okay. Thank you, Gavin. So after this initial 10 minutes, so basically Gavin used your minutes, Simon.
That's fine.
So let's go. Just
birthday,
one note for the audience. Please write your questions in comments or send them directly to info@energynewsbiz. Now we're going to exchange. Simon, you can start by commenting, and the two of you can exchange questions directly. So I will not interfere.
So Gavin's work is perhaps the best in the world of what it is, and I actually use it. My compliments to you. So my work, however, does something a little different. So you've mapped out very well how things have happened to this point thus far, like how historically how we're going. I've mapped if we were to radically re-engineer everything, take down our fossil fuel systems and decarbonize everything gets wiped out. And the assumption is that we're going to do it all in 25 years, by 2050. So the technologies that we're actually doing going forward, you have to work out like how many units we're talking about, how many cars, how many trucks, how much distance do they travel. All that stuff got mapped out. And then if we were to actually look at the metal content for each unit, for each battery, for each wind turbine, for each solar panel, and all that, an estimate of the quantity of metals that we're talking about. So what I've actually come up with is this massive number of metal that we now need going forward in a step change. It's not the same demand as before. Like in addition to existing demand, we now have this step change that we're now sort of coming in. Now, the work that I've done has to actually be, everything's got to be based on a peer-reviewed reference. So I had to actually have a kilogram per megawatt estimate for battery chemistries and stuff like that. So the information I've got is a couple of years old, but it does provide an estimate of the volume of metal that we would need very quickly. Now, where do we get that from so quickly? And so my thing is not to, I would take your analysis, Gavin, and I would extend it into a further field where if we were to problem solve in this direction, and if we can see there's problems long range with a particular target, so can we go back to the drawing board and come up with a different plan? That's how I would approach that. So I could say more, but over to you, mate.
I think when we've looked at the numbers, and I've done sort of foresight studies where we start now and just project forward. I've looked at other things where you say, here's the target, say 2050, and work backwards. All right. Now, and I think, when I first started doing this sort of work 15 years ago, after sort of meeting Tom and sort of the work we're doing in Australia around sort of peak minerals and trying to understand all of that, the world's changed enormously. Australia went from 1 lithium mine in 2015 to 9 in 2019. Now, of those, about 4 or 5 didn't even have a drill hole and any exploration work at all in 2015.
Yeah.
All right. And Australia's
remarkable.
lithium resources have gone absolutely exponential. All right. And so Australia's lithium production has also increased substantially as well. Now, when you're looking at a lot of the projections forward for different things, whether it's solar and other things, we keep overachieving globally, right? And some countries much better than others, in particular China. All right. So when we're looking at it, I think the trends are, and we've seen this, and we've seen the response, and I've recently rechecked data for things like indium and a whole range of other metals. We are seeing increases in production commensurate with the sort of demand projections, whether that's lithium, whether that's rare earths and others. So now I've used the International Energy Agency as a sort of a base case. You know, they've got things wrong in the past. They've always underestimated the growth of renewables, for example. So I think when we're looking at what's actually happening out there, I think we are seeing supply catch up. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't issues. Of course there are, and we'll come back to many of those. All right. I noticed the question there in the chat as well about, you know, can we really sustain that? Now, there's all sorts of reasons and different issues depending on which commodity, and that sort of the stories for each individual element will vary, right? But I think what we're seeing is that we can increase production. The question is, are we actually increasing it in a way that's responsible? And the answer to that often at the moment is no. All right, and we have to be honest about that. So we do have to work out how to do better. Right, and we are seeing that. And whether it's China, whether it's the Europe, elsewhere, we want to make sure that in future we do things properly and we don't leave a mess behind. All right, so I'm not worried about how much resources we have in the ground. I know there's more than enough for the projections out there. I think the questions really come back to its terms and conditions. How do we make sure we develop and operate mines, smelters and refineries, remembering that many of the elements that we need, you can only get from a smelter or refinery. You can't mine for gallium, you can't mine for germanium and many others. So you have to extract them at a zinc refinery, an alumina refinery, or other things like that. So I think certainly when I've looked at the numbers and the data, and we've recently updated the view across the periodic table on that, I'm very confident that the numbers are there and where the evidence shows that we're on the right track.
So what I would say then is I didn't actually look at IEA predictions. What I did was a completely different approach, where if we took the system as it was in 2018, for the calendar year of 2018, we did the same things, but it was now completely fossil free. And then I worked out the number of cars, number of trucks, the physical activity done, the industrial demands. And if we were to deliver the same actions, physical actions, with non-fossil fuel systems, how many units are we sort of talking about? So I didn't rely on any IEA predictions of what, like the market will increase 10%, 50% in the next 20 years. It's what do we need to replace the existing system as it is now? Now, of course, you're not going to do that in one step. But then there was a case, well, this is the quantity of metal needed to replace everything as it was in 2018, 6 years ago. No growth. I'm not talking about growth here. I'm talking about as we were in 2018. And then there was the, well, we want to get it done completely by 2050. And so when I started this, that actually gave me a 27-year window to deliver on. And so then I just divided that by 27, so we would have to do this every year. And of course, that's not how, that's a very crude, simplistic approach. And so the purpose of my work was not to predict the future, but to demonstrate that we've got a serious problem we should look at. And my hope was a group of people could step in and say, brave attempt, we will now make a better plan and your work's now obsolete. And so the work that I've done is very crude, it's very simple. The numbers don't include everything, which means they're conservative. And it just means that we've got to look at different things. Not that we're running out, we should look at different things. And I've actually proposed a counter plan that doesn't have the same resource footprint issues. But this is the green transition sort of territory. Or at least I hope.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm old enough to remember, and I used to teach, my students many years ago, of course, that when you're looking at various renewable energy technologies, the energy return on energy invested was certainly much lower than fossil fuels, right? that's changing, right? And they're now leaping forward. And I think they're heading in a really good direction. They're getting stronger and stronger all the time, i.e. more energy return on for the energy invested to make them, right? So I think, and that's a positive thing, right? And certainly there's certainly debate in the literature about whether renewables are now exceeding things like shale gas or not. But the point being is that the technology is improving and it's getting better all the time, right? So, and I think that's part of the problem in many ways. And when you're looking at, even with the IEA scenarios, they have included the demand. It's not just a forecast. It's actually a demand of some of the trends that we have to see. Whether it's going forward, whether it's starting at net zero, there's various ways to do it. But that's the sort of way they've done it. It's not everything either, and there's still other sectors we've got to look at, whether it's medical, there's all sorts of other things as well. But when we're looking at mining, that's some of the things we can get some synergies, whether we're looking at renewable energy, and that's certainly we're seeing a lot of action in there to actually build renewable energy projects at mines, which helps decarbonize them. And that shifts their whole, if you're looking at it from a life cycle assessment point of view, and as we would both agree, as ore grades decline, things like your energy, water, CO2 footprints or intensities go up. So there are ways to actually I suppose, redesign mining to actually make sure we change the nature of those curves so they become a decarbonized curve as well. So I think there's all sorts of things there, but I think at a basic level, I think that's the sort of way we've got to approach it, is the technologies, who knows where they'll be in 10 years. If we go back 10 years ago, no one saw the rise of lithium iron phosphate batteries to the extent that they now are, right? They were a technology that was available, but it wasn't predicted to sort of really take over things like EVs in China and so on. So who knows exactly where the technology will end up. All we know is that where we're heading is actually in the right direction to achieve all of the goals that we're looking for, such as net zero.
So human innovation is a thing. Absolutely, that is the case. Two things to say there. I don't use energy return and energy invested. There is a massive divide in the literature about the debates that are going on about how the calculation's made, and it's got to the point where the tool is not really usable anymore. So what I did instead was, in the calendar year of 2018, I collected the statistics of what each energy system delivered to the grid. What was the installed nameplate capacity, and what actual electrical power did they deliver across the year? And that captured things like maintenance issues. And what that did was is not what each of these energy systems promised, not what they thought they could do, not what in theory, but what they actually delivered. And so, all right, this number of solar panels and wind turbines in those systems delivered this amount of power. These coal-fired power stations, these gas-fired stations with this installed capacity delivered that amount of power. And so I was able to do a straight take this system out, and now we're going to drop in these new systems and deliver to the market. So what that does is it steps around the need for getting energy return and energy invested right at all. This is just a straight brutal delivery to market, right? So that's. I started out with this work having lots of theoretical models that were pulled in from the literature, but when I went through the review process, I was destroyed several times. I was taken out to the woodshed on a few things and said, look, the commercial world has actually surpassed this paper. We now do this instead. Yeah. And so this is, so my approach for that was just to say, look, we need to deliver. Now, the second thing is the true purpose of my work was to highlight the fact that we should be looking at where we get our raw materials from and what we need them for. Whereas the mentality, I don't know if you came to the same conclusion or not, but for me at least, and this is working in the mining industry itself, is metals were just a business. Everything was just a cost. It was all just and everything was compartmentalized in terms of where things came from, and no one really cared about this stuff. So when we're making plans for the future, very rarely do we think in terms of ecological economics. And so what I'm trying to show here is we should be thinking about not just the environmental footprint of everything we do, but how much physical resources, why, where, and what do we need to do to get them? And none of that is actually part of the existing thinking at all for any of our strategic thinking. It's just like magic will happen, the market will fix it. And
I don't think it's as simple as that at all. I think certainly my work and many others, that is very well understood. Now, at a policy level, yeah, sure, there's issues with how things might get implemented. But what we've seen is the Inflation Reduction Act in America. We've got the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU. So that's manifestations that policymakers do get this, and actually part of the subsidies and the or the tax credits, as they're called, are precisely to support mining and fresh supply into the different manufacturing ecosystems. So I think it's unfair to say that people don't get it. People don't see the problem and aren't thinking about raw material. Now, sure, the Sustainable Development Goals don't mention mining explicitly, except for perhaps sustainable production and consumption. All right, and that's largely more around the circular economy, which we'll come back to. All right, but so I think it still comes back to the same basic issues: is where do we mine, how do we mine, who controls that mining, and so on. And I think there's and I think some of the questions coming up in the chat, and we'll get to those soon. There are many things we use which you can't recycle. Antimony used in fire retardants, as far as I know, that's not really recyclable. All right, so phosphorus, a lot of what we use phosphorus for is not really recyclable. All right, so and that's fine. We've got tens of billions of tons of decent quality phosphate rock reserves around the world, so that's not an issue in the short term, and certainly not even the medium to longer term. Given, I think, when we look at exploration and when we see different countries around the world, their resources are still increasing over time, often quite substantially. So I think when you're looking at it, that's the real picture. When you're seeing, and some of the numbers there, as I mentioned before, the more recent research coming out now, and it is after, obviously, you've set up all of your work, is that the EROI values, the energy return on energy invested, are going up for solar and going up for wind. And that's what we would expect based on both the design, the improvements in manufacturing, the different technologies that are being implemented. I saw recently that I think the 4 gigawatt solar array in the UAE is actually using 500 kilowatt panels now, not 250 kilowatt, because they're double layered. So I think we're seeing all of these things change and evolve very, very quickly, and that's why it's extremely hard to put together a model of such extraordinary sophistication to capture everything that we need. Right? So I think it's certainly a challenge. That's why I've just always stuck to just working on the mining side. That's what I can do well, and that's the way I can contribute.
So my comments before were based on when I talk to senior people now quite a lot, and you ask them questions, and how they answer those questions is very telling, as much as what they actually say. And I would often ask, for example, for your particular region of Central Europe, how many new power stations are you going to be putting up to phase out fossil fuels, and what kind? And senior people in charge who are actually making decisions, overseeing such a thing, had no concept of even that level of discussion. Like they obviously hadn't thought about it. They're waiting for someone to tell them what they should do. This is just my personal experience. And what I also found is there's have you thought about what I was actually working on at the time was wind turbine blades, and at the time, wind turbine blades we didn't really have a recycling solution for them. This is a couple of years ago. I believe there's a new product out in the market that actually sort of does do that now, but at the time there wasn't. And so I was asking, so how many wind turbines are we talking about? He said, we don't know. It's all right. What materials are in them? It's no, that's someone else does all that. There was this feeling of compartmentalization. I'll do my bit, and someone else does their bit, and everyone just hopes it all works out. Whereas what I'm trying to put forward is the idea of systems thinking, where everything's connected to everything else. And if you make a change in one part of the system, you can have implications all the way along. And what I'm still advocating for is the sourcing of raw materials has got to be part of the discussion of design and waste recycling, with the idea that what we call recycling will eventually merge with mining. That's a paradigm. And I'm finding that a lot of people look at me very strangely when I sort of suggest such things. So yeah, I just, it's my experience so far that everyone sees things as a market. And yes, you have these policies, things have come out, the circular economy and the raw materials. And so there is some awareness there. Yeah, but in practice, when you actually get people to do things and actually make decisions and you ask them basic questions, it's like they're giving something lip service. And then they're just moving on, someone else can take care of that. Which, okay, fair enough. You can't do everything. But,
I think I mean, I'm sure, as you well know, the basic logic I've used for pretty much almost my entire academic career is mining is cheap financially. Let's say let's brutally simplify it and use stereotypes because it's mostly true, I think. So mining is cheaper cost, right, financially, but has a higher environmental cost.
Yep.
Recycling has a much lower environmental cost in broad terms, but is more expensive. All right. And that's part of the problem, is that we're not paying for a lot of the full costs with mining. We don't have a really good example is the Jagersfontein tailings dam failure, 2 or 3 years ago. Now, that was 51 years after the mine closed. Now, there's no perpetual fund that was set up from mining, sort of a sovereign wealth fund or anything else like that, other insurance type mechanism that allowed South Africa to monitor that dam, make sure it was continuing to stay stable. And then if there was a problem, go in and do some maintenance, or if there's a failure, you've got a fund there that can go in and help pay for the cleanup. Now, no country in the world has something like that, as far as I know. Even countries such as Brazil that suffered horrendous failures recently. So there are solutions out there to some of these sorts of things. But when you're looking at it, that's what we need to think about is, gradually we can increase recycling of all sorts of things. We don't necessarily have the technology for everything yet. There are a lot of people working on it. There are some things there where 5 years ago we didn't have solutions. Now we do, right? Especially around whether it's permanent magnet recycling, things like EV battery recycling. And the devil's in the detail. The move to lithium iron phosphate batteries has removed two very expensive metals from EV battery, namely nickel and cobalt. So that's making the economic case for recycling, more difficult. But that's where we need to make sure we are dealing with, whether it's the policy side, whether it's the regulatory side, and looking at those commercial incentives and the way all of these systems work. So I think there's, and some countries are much more advanced in their way of thinking around this. Part of the reason China is such a strong leader and has such a dominant position across the periodic table is because they've done that systems thinking. They've built it.
They have.
All right.
Yes, they have.
And the rest of us are now realizing, and we've got to start catching up. All right. So, but the problem, and I think it's sort of certainly coming through in some of the comments there as well, is that many communities, and it's not just Europe, it's also the same in Australia and elsewhere for the most part. When we talk about new mining projects, the first thing they think about are these old legacy projects that have caused problems. So I think there's a solution there we need to start thinking about, and actually at a global level, not just within the EU or elsewhere. Right, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's something that we need to sort of work on. Now, as a thought experiment, we could go, let's say 0.01% of, let's say, profit. You could say revenue, either way, some mechanism like this. Let's put that aside into some kind of fund that's used as a global mining legacy fund, as the UN Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition metals recently recommended. So now they didn't put a number to it, but they did recommend the setting up of a global mining legacy fund. All right. So I think when you're looking at it, there are ways to deal with a lot of these sorts of issues and make sure we connect the dots. Part of the work that I think a lot of us in this broad space do is making sure that as we're looking at the growth of technologies, we link it back to the source materials. And that's certainly, what I've been doing for many years and many others. So now these things, it takes time to sort of put all of these things into place. All right, but we're getting there, and I think what we'll see, and especially with the more turbulent world we'll be seeing in the near future, it's going to become a lot more urgent. So I think that's sort of something we need to be mindful of. But yeah, it's it's not easy.
Social license to operate. That I absolutely 100% agree with that approach, and I think it might have to be more involved again. So in terms of what I'm looking at is we are replacing the existing system with a new technology that uses a different material footprint in proportions. Like if we're going to electrify everything, we're using very different metals that to what we like. We've always used lithium and cobalt for a long time, but now we actually want to use them in large quantities. And you can. Part of my work was to estimate the volume, the quantity of metals. And yes, that is the subject of hot debate. But once we get the quantity of metals, how do we source it? Now, for example, I've come up with this obscene number, and it's been subject to quite a stringent peer review of 6.1 billion tons of copper needs to be mined, refined, and actually sort of in place by 2050. And that if we take the copper mine of Escondida, which in 2023 had 1.1 million tons of copper brought to market, we would need 218 such mines in addition to what we already have operating every year for the next 25 years. And the problem is not so much this running out of resources; it's the scale of the problem that we need to bring in so fast. Like 1.3 billion tons of lithium. These are huge, and so if we had like a century to run up to that, then we could do things at a rate. Like it takes time to actually do exploration to get a resource, and then take a resource from a estimated resource to a reported reserve, pre-feasibility study, and then to take a PFS, turn it into a producing mine. That's like 10, 15 years, and sometimes 20 years. But with all of these things, there are exceptions. Like you were saying, the lithium mines in Australia went from a completely greenfield situation with no drill holes at all to a producing mine in something like 12 months. That shocked everyone.
4 years.
Yeah. Oh, it was 4 years, was it? Okay. Anyway, it was that example shocks everyone. So, but in terms of recycling, I used to be part of the recycling world when I was in the University of Liège, and so yes, I believe recycling is actually an integral part of the solution going forward. But I took all the copper metal that was mined between 1990 and 2023. That was all the information I could get easily. Summed it all together, and I came up with 520 million tons. And so, if we were now, when things wear out, we put them on a rubbish dump somewhere, right? So and if so, everything for the last 20 years is on a rubbish dump somewhere. For example, thought experiment: if I was to go out there and find all that stuff, extract it, recycle it 100%, smelt it down into copper ingots, put it on the ground, and says, is that enough metal to completely manufacture our new post-fossil fuel system? The answer is no, because we need 11.6 times that volume.
Yeah, but the numbers you're sort of citing there are based on some pretty significant assumptions around what scale of battery storage or other energy storage we need. And I think the evidence is showing we don't need anywhere near that. And so I think that, so when you're looking at it, whether it's the IEA or many other scholars out there, there's Mark Jacobson's work and there's many others out there, that's not the scale we need. Right? You can see whether it's, California is sort of a good example. I think a great leader in the integration of batteries into a grid. You're looking at Australia as, on the forefront there as well. And so I think when you're looking at it, the numbers, I've used, and I've just used the IEA numbers, and that's the right ballpark. So we're looking at numbers that are certainly the order of magnitude we have for reserves. Now, when you're looking at things, and we could take iron, for example, iron can be in products that last anything from weeks or months, such as a can for food, or maybe 25 years for cutlery, to 50 to 100 years for a building. Right? So the residence times obviously depend very much on the use that you put it to. Right? So obviously things like kitchen, throwaway sort of cans or things like that, that can be eminently recycled very quickly. Obviously, if it's still inside a building, we can't recycle that until that building is demolished. So all of these things are what people have been taking note of and modeling and so on for a long time. That's the whole industrial ecology field before the whole industrial ecology field got renamed as circular economy, right? Because of course, industrial ecology doesn't have the word economy in it. So some people preferred circular economy. But that is the field of industrial ecology, and looking at that and building, whether it's the long-term data sets, to say, well, what has been the flow from mining through smelting, refining, manufacturing use to end of life? How much can be recycled? And for some things, sure, we still need to build a lot of stocks in our system. And lithium is just a good example where we have to build a lot of stocks in our system before we're going to start to see enough actually flow from used batteries in the near future. We're not far off from that now. Right, where we'll start to see the flows of stocks from, say, things like used EV batteries that become available for recycling. So I think there's a lot of complexity to all of that. But I think at the moment, when I've looked at at various work out there, including some work we've done myself and others, I'm not worried about the resources and things like that. I know we can transform the system and it can work. So the question is, how do we make sure we are linking in, whether it's the policy side, making sure there's opportunities for mines, right? So in Europe, that means mines, whether it be for lithium. We still need to think about copper. copper's in or out of people's critical minerals list for different reasons. It sort of certainly wasn't didn't make the grade in the recent UK assessment that I led, but it doesn't mean we ignore copper. We still need to be worried about how much copper we're mining. So we need to move roughly, if you use the IEA numbers, from about 21 million tonnes of copper produced annually at the moment, that's about 2023 numbers, to around about 40 to 45 million tonnes by 2050. Now, if you add up all of the copper produced between now and then, you smack on close to the billion tonnes of reserves that the USGS publish. All right, and we know that many mines, and Escondida is an extraordinarily classic example, where when they started, they thought they had about I can't remember the exact reserve when they started in 1991. But if you look at the growth in resources over time for Escondida, it's extraordinary. And many other deposits around, whether it's Chile and elsewhere as well. And there's some examples, of course, yes, where they predicted it was 1 million tonnes of copper and they mined 1 million tonnes of copper. All right. So, but I think when you're looking at it, from a bird's eye view, and you've done all the global studies, that's where I'm never worried about the amount of resources. It's where we mine, how we mine, who controls that mining. Because if we look at the cobalt, for example, and people often point to the Congo and say the Congo is, say, 60 or 70% of world cobalt production. And cobalt is always a byproduct typically. It's rarely ever a primary product. That's another issue we'll come back to. But what people often sort of fail to appreciate is that most of the cobalt being mined in the Congo, at least in the large-scale mines, and most of it is actually large-scale mining, despite a lot of the focus being on artisanal mining. And some of that artisanal mining is actually well done, and some of it is deeply problematic, right? But most of the large-scale mining is actually controlled by China. And it goes straight back to China for refining, where they actually control about 60% of the cobalt refining capacity worldwide. So they're the sort of questions that are, and sort of issues that we need to think about. So, so I think that the magnitudes are right. I'm not worried about that. I think when you're looking at it and you're looking at the how recycling sort of fits into that, we can already do a lot better on recycling some metals, whether that be copper. The lead, we're already at a circular economy at pretty much globally. All right. So some places are a bit far behind, but but for the most part, especially the developed parts of the world, we are certainly at a circular economy for lead. So I think there's certainly many opportunities to increase recycling and things like that. But recycling is not easy, as I know you understand very well.
So yeah, so when I did this comes back to, I've done an approach which is completely different to everyone else, right? And so this is what's getting me into all sorts of trouble, I suppose. But when I did my study at the time, electric vehicles represented about 1.5% of the global transport fleet of cars and trucks at the time. Maritime shipping was 100%, as was ICE, as was aviation. And we wanted to decarbonize all of that. And so we hadn't really sort of built, and renewable energy at the time was only about 6% of primary energy. We are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. The majority of it was still oil, gas, and coal. And so we have yet to actually sort of build out. And when we put these things on the ground, we've got to build them, and they've got like a working life of, what is it, 20 years. That number keeps increasing. When I first started and I talked to insurance people, they were saying that wind turbines had a working life of about 12 years before they wanted to replace them. But I said, look, just use 20 as a general cut, like as a general estimate, and that will assume as things get bigger. Where my work differs with Net Zero America and Jacobs and what have you is that they all assume and are working on the idea that the buffer for wind and solar that's needed is only 4 to 6 hours, something of that order. And I'm actually out at 28 days. In my work, I've got a calculation for 6 hours, 48 hours plus 10%, 28 days, and there's one monstrous study that actually came back with 12 weeks. Which that frightened me a little, but I put it in anyway because it was supposed to be a reference point. Now, 4 to 6 hours, when the sun goes down, solar panels don't work. Right now, 4 to 6 hours won't get us through a single night, let alone manage the difference between winter and summer on a seasonal basis. The studies that they had done had actually sort of gone out to do a particular job, and they did it well, but they'd missed two very important points. One was that we had the day-night cycle, and at night solar panels won't work, so we need to get through a night. And then there was the seasonal difference between summer and winter. So I downloaded some information off the US Department of Energy website, the PJM RTO power grid, serves 100 million people. And they had wind and solar. So I got 2 years of data. And what I found was that solar power underperformed from an even metric, underperformed 6 months of the year, and wind for about 4 months of the year. And they did this for 2 years in a row. And so it would, but the way we balance our energy systems out is because we want supply and demand to be even. If we need more power, we'll just get it from somewhere else. And so these systems were balanced up against oil and, gas and coal, but mainly gas because it was so flexible. So if these systems expand to the point where they are so large that they have to be self-sufficient, internally self-sufficient, we've got to balance that out. And that's where my assumptions come from. And they are assumptions, to be fair, right, of why we need these buffers. But I have 4 calculations now and numbers for all 4. If 6 hours is the answer, well, we've got the numbers. To me, to balance the difference between summer and winter is one thing. We've also got examples like a personal example was when I was in Australia, it rained for 8 weeks once, and the solar panels on the roof didn't produce for most of that time. And that was a weather anomaly, but that happens every now and then when we become vulnerable to that. We've got a system at the moment we are dependent on fossil fuels, which happens, which is very reliable, all weathers, all locations. No matter what, we can turn it on, the switches there, and it's all very easy. Where wind and solar in particular are now vulnerable to the weather. And if we go this way, because if we take wind and solar off the books, what do we do? And we can't, fossil fuels are going, that's not a question. So is it a case that society just has to change how it uses energy to come into line with this? And yes, we can have a much smaller buffer, but we will have to operate differently. We'll have to behave differently. Is that the answer? And so, yeah.
There's many things to say to that. One, we have a system. And so therefore, when you're looking at things like solar panels, sure, solar panels don't work at night, but again, when we turn the tap on in our home, where does that water come from? It's not directly coming from rainfall. It's come because we've built a system that stores water, and we have a network, we have pumps, we have treatment systems that make sure the water supply is very reliable. So systems thinking is stock standard for how we approach these things. This is what national grids are doing all over the place, or regional grids, etc. So if it's not solar, wind is often blowing somewhere, so there's some capacity there. But then the rest will come from whatever's available in different regions. In Australia, obviously very heavy solar, wind, and you've got, whether it's battery storage, you've got pumped hydro storage, you've got all sorts of different possibilities there in Australia. For some parts of the world, you've got geothermal. Some parts of the world, biomass may make sense. All right, so now exactly all of those areas, that's outside my area of expertise. What I can say for looking at all of these things, from the various people that have actually gone through and looked at 30 years of weather data, and often I've seen people doing it on an hourly basis or even finer resolution. So we can get through these things. We can design systems that actually account for all of these things, and we're seeing that in action, whether it's California and elsewhere. All right, now, so I'm confident that there are others out there, and it's not my area of expertise. So I'm only commenting as someone as an observer of these things. All right, but I'm not worried about that. The thing that I think we need to be, I suppose, where my area of expertise is really focused on is the source, is the supply of the different minerals that go into making these technologies. So, so I think, and again, a lot of it also comes down to the assumptions when we're looking at these things. When we're looking at the design life, sometimes we often we can underestimate them. If you look at vanadium redox flow batteries, one of their big selling points is that they actually have an extremely long, they're expected to have an extremely long shelf life. All right, so their components don't wear down, and you don't get as much chemical wear and tear as you do with other batteries. So that makes them very suited to large-scale grid applications. So so I think, do we have absolutely every solution perfectly engineered and designed yet? No, of course we don't. Have we got more than enough to be able to make the decisions and set the trajectory? Absolutely. So that's what I always keep coming back to.
So the problem with, not the problem, the foundation of my work is an estimate of the volumes that we need the quantities versus need versus our ability to deliver on. My assumptions were based on my own work, because when I looked at things like storage for solar and wind are now flagged to take out 70% of the energy mix, according to an IEA prediction for 2050. I said, okay, great. So it's got to be something. Knock out fossil fuels, what do we do? And all right, so they're now quite large. So solar, for example, now represents 35% of the global energy mix. And the assumption that 4 to 6 hours buffer storage, it struck me immediately that wouldn't get us through a single night, let alone balance out summer and winter. So I then went off and did my own.
To be fair, though, Simon, the other thing we have to remember is demand goes down overnight. We don't have to supply the same peak demands that we get in the early morning and then over an evening of a night time when people are at home and relaxing, etc. So the demand's a lot less overnight. So and that's what we engineer our systems for.
Absolutely true. But when I actually got to the point of, well, how do we get through winter? And remember, when I was doing most of this work, I was sitting in Finland through one of the darkest winters I've ever had in my life. And so when I looked out the window, it was, even though Finland's a very extreme example, but that it motivated me to go and look at the statistics. And for example, solar produces power 11.4% of the time globally. In California, it's as high as 25%. California seems to be the best in the world. Wind at the time was 24.9%. Now, engineering improvements have got that up over 33, as I understand it. But even so, most of the time, these assets are not producing power. And try to get them to line up perfectly, as in when one's not producing, can we go to another? So that had problems as well. So then I went to pumped hydro. This is how we actually, I know this is not your field, I'm just telling you my path on this. I went to pumped hydro, and that was the cheapest way to store a lot of electricity at the moment. But now we're back to the quantity. And so even if we were able to find enough sites, and a study will say, look, there are lots of sites that are suitable where we have a hydroelectric system and you have like a reservoir up above that geographically, and you can then transfer water between them. So the amount of fresh water that system would tie up, because the amount of storage is the bottleneck there if we were able to do it, followed by how do we transmit the power from where it's generated and stored to where it's needed. And that is a difficult problem to deal with. So then I went to hydrogen.
It's not that difficult. We've been doing transmission for well over a century. So
that amount of
looking at the technologies now, we can do it even more efficiently. So with less losses. So that is not an issue.
So, well, I was using the Solar Star system where they were developing solar power in West Australia, but transporting it to Singapore, I think. And the undersea cables there. Yes, we can transmit power long distances, and I think now we use aluminium for a lot of the power lines now, and graphene is now possible to use that. In fact, my work doesn't look at transmission at all. It's just what's inside each battery and each car. I don't look at transmission at all. But the actual storage of power, all of these systems work to scale them up to the size, the volume of it, and store it for such a long time. That's when the trouble started. And when I went and talked to government groups around the world, for one group or another, and said, what do you think you're going to do? And everyone said, well, we like batteries. And the reason we like batteries is they saw them as cheap, they're flexible, they can be installed in any weather, in any shape, any size. They didn't like compressed air because there were engineering problems in scaling up. And spinning flywheels, they said, well, we need to be able to store energy longer than there's actually practical, and supercapacitors are the same. So everyone put their collective hat on batteries. And I said, well, why don't we do something else? Like, do something else instead. And they didn't want to hear that. And which is where I suppose this work came from. And I said, look, I put the numbers on the ground to show that we should actually change direction on all this. And so it comes down to the quantities and me not believing the existing studies of how much buffer we need, and actually then downloading empirical data myself. So what that means is I'm now out on a limb on my own and everyone disagrees with me. Right, and so who's right, who's wrong? Well, history will tell, I suppose. So,
well, as I point out, and there was a great paper by Graham Turner many years ago, which looked at 30 years since limits to growth. And the reason why that's important, I mean, and as I know we'll both agree on this simple point, models are only as good as their accuracy.
Yeah.
Right now, as the age-old adage goes, all models are wrong, just that some are useful. All right. Now, if you've got a model from the early 1970s that says we're
Yeah.
going to have this much pollution, this much
Mm.
population, this much demand, and so on,
Mm.
well, what were the actual numbers 30 years later? And the limits to growth was actually very accurate. Right. There were some things
Yeah.
they got wrong, resource depletion being one, but they did get right the fact that as you move down the resource depletion curve, to use sort of their thinking, the environmental impacts go up. And we know that's the case, whether it's declining ore grade, more waste, waste rock, tailings, etc. Yes, all very true. So I think on some of the basic aspects, that model has proven actually quite robust. All right. So I think when you're looking at a lot of these types of things, models are important, but they're not perfect. All right.
Yeah.
And, having built models myself over the years, those assumptions really matter. And I think one of the things that, when I look out there and I'm saying, well, one, there's the assumptions around, whether reserves and or resources are enough. And, certainly my work's been very conclusive in that area. Right. But when we're looking at linking that to the different technology drivers that are pushing the demands, then I'm confident that when you're looking at whether it's the battery storage, but whether it's EVs, all sorts of things, you can do it various ways, right? But we're on the right path, and I think we don't need certainly the level of battery storage that your system, your quantification suggests. I think what we're seeing in California and elsewhere is that the numbers that the IAA are putting out there are probably in the right ballpark. Maybe wrong in some aspects, as models often can be wrong. But certainly, I think at a fundamental level, I think what we're seeing is the different systems will roll out in different places, but there'll be different combinations of technologies. Right? Some countries, take Iceland, obviously got access to geothermal, but whereas Australia doesn't have access to that type of geothermal, but it may have access to deep, hot, dry rock type geothermal. But that's technically challenging. But the industry, from over the last sort of 10, 15 years, then that's come a long way. And we're seeing that now. You've got a new German project now, which is a combined geothermal and lithium project.
Yeah. So we're all waiting on a breakthrough in drilling, deep drilling for geothermal to work. And if that happens, then all of this work gets scrapped and we start again. So, so my approach is, instead of actually sort of believing projections from groups like the IEA and the UN and the World Bank and stuff, is I've taken an engineering approach based on the best I have at the moment, the best I can actually defend from a publication. If we were to deliver this and engineer this and actually deliver it as we've got now, this is what we need to do, right? And so I was just based on empirical data that's downloaded, as in historical data across 2022, 2023. For the actual proportions of what had actually happened with these systems. And so, but then the thing now requires us to think differently and do differently. I personally, for example, like sodium batteries, or the fluoride in your toothpaste can be turned into a battery. And the corrosion problems of fluoride, there's a way around that too. I like the idea of graphene being used in a replacement in some of the conductivity issues. You can use aluminium as a substitution for copper in some respects, but not all, because it has problems with brittleness and there's different thermochemical problems there. But what I'm sort of finding is the people I was sort of talking to who are planning for the future have put their hat on a series of technologies that are actually quite old, and to the point where any discussion about new ideas was being shut down. Like, I'm in a battery chemistry research group, or I was. The project's finished now, but at the time I was. And I stood up and said, can we look at battery chemistries other than lithium? They said, no, sit down. No, the market's going to be lithium based and we don't want to hear anything else. But come on, guys. But no, they didn't hear it. And so that's what I'm saying is and this is actually the purpose of my work, is to raise a series of flags, and then we develop an intelligent response to it. That's what the motivation was in the beginning. So I suppose what I'm sort of saying, and now what I've actually got is like a counter plan, is we do have the minerals if we do things differently and use a different set of technology vectors to get to where we need to go. But what was proposed, for the last couple of years in the conventional green transition, from my understanding, won't work. That's my understanding, my conclusion.
No, that's where I would certainly have a different conclusion. That I think with the trajectory we're on with the existing technologies and their continuing improvements over time and so on, I think we are on the right track. And I think that means we are, whether it's the energy return on energy invested, whether it's just the actual material efficiency, capacity factors, they're all going up. I mean, there's some comments in the chat coming through on that, wind farms are now getting up to 50%. Part of the reason for offshore is that they have, at periods of time, you can see some offshore wind turbines getting up to 80% capacity factor. All right. And what we're seeing in some parts of the world is, certainly as coal-fired power stations age, they get less reliable, so I think I'm confident that the system that we're looking at and that is being rolled out, I'm confident it's the right mix as we all understand it at the moment, understanding that, we may not necessarily have solutions for everything perfectly, but I think we're working on them and we'll get there. And because it's not a choice, we have to get there.
Yeah, we certainly do. Yeah, I'm just working on the empirically reported data in a global sense. Right, so will wind go to an 80% capacity for all wind turbines? That'll be extraordinary if we could do that. But my understanding is, the grid availability is still it's still late 20s, with a theoretical possibility of going over. We're talking about aggregate, everything together. So if we can get data to actually show that at a global scale that's reportable, then that's the answer, and that's what we use. It's I don't. To me, society is still stuck on how fossil fuels operates, and we haven't. When we have like a new energy technology come in, whatever that is, we've got to learn how to use it. And I don't think, and this might be part of the problem. We think post-fossil fuels technology will operate the same way as fossil fuels, and that maybe is actually shaping our thinking.
No, I think we're learning that things will be different, and there's different opportunities too. Being able to charge your EV at home, for example, means that you're not reliant on going down to the local petrol station, for example. So I think that there will be differences, and of course there will be. But I used to be much more pessimistic. Now, and if we think back over the last 150 years, what are all the different revolutions that have come in technology-wise? Electricity, central water systems, centralized sewage systems. Flying, and going not from, you could fly from Melbourne to New York in one trip now if you wanted to. All right, but we've gone through the rise of computers, the rise of mobile phones. We've got the rise of tablets, and pretty soon we'll have the rise of quantum computing and AI. So I think technologies, and I certainly remember the very first mobile phone I had was a brick. It was sort of 3 times the size of my hand and weighed a sort of a metaphoric ton, so to speak. All right. And you look at mobile phones now, you look at what you can do with them. Like, just look at this, it's, and ironically, of course, 70% of the value of the 60 odd elements in a mobile phone is actually gold. I haven't updated that number for a while, but it's probably still something like that. All right. So what pays for things like recycling is actually gold, not the lithium or a lot of the other, let's say exotic metals in there. So I'm confident that when new technologies are introduced, people can adapt and take advantage of them pretty quick. And history shows that very extensively. So now what we're doing is exactly what we've done before when it comes to our electricity systems. 100 years ago in Victoria, where I come from in Australia, Victoria was still mostly dependent on importing black coal from other states in Australia until we built our brown coal-fired power stations and made Victoria independent. Now, it was extremely cheap, but extremely carbon intensive. All right, and so there's just no future there. So there's, gradually those power stations are scheduled to shut down. All right, and we're already seeing one of the biggest ones. One big one already shut down, like the Hazelwood or Morwell complex. So, I'm confident that people, and not only just the engineers and so on as well, that design the technology and then the way things are rolled out, but I think as a lot of consumers, we learn to take advantage of different things, whether it's mobile phones and just texting, whether it's even social media for all of its great evils and benefits. People have learned how to take advantage of that. So I'm more confident that as things continue to evolve and roll out, even solutions such as putting chargers on poles on streets, so that way people in apartment blocks can charge their EVs. There are solutions out there that I think people are picking up on, and these if we go back long enough to the mid 1990s, Google didn't even exist. Facebook didn't even exist. So Tesla didn't even exist. So I think when you're looking at that, these opportunities are extraordinary in their scale. And so we've seen many examples where those opportunities of people have taken great advantage of them and built companies like Google and many others.
Sure. So all of that is true. But at the moment, I just looked up on the net, the global EV fleet is about 1.5% of global transport. Right. So we still have got to build most of the system. I was trying to look at the most up-to-date proportion for renewables, for electric generation. We've got a massive production thing ahead of us. Right. So my thing is, what materials will go into that production? And then if we want to do it quickly, how are we going to do that? Now, we can disagree on the size of the buffer for wind and solar. I stand by the information I've got, because it's actually based on empirical data I've downloaded. And basic things like anyway, but to me, we've got a massive system in front of us that we haven't even begun to go forward. And the system we've built at the moment was
We have started moving forward in many ways. The UK no longer has
1.5%.
power, so I think that's not a correct characterization.
1.5% of the existing fleet is EVs, which means we've got more than 95% to go. We've only just started. We haven't even begun to decarbonize maritime shipping or aviation.
Yes, we have. There are many moves in that. Whether it's I've seen work in that.
Give me some data.
Still much harder than maritime, definitely.
Give me some data. What proportion of the aviation industry is now non-fossil fuel?
That number I don't have to hand, but aviation is much harder. When I've looked at this in the past, and it's not something I recheck for this, but and aviation is something that. The technology is not there yet. Now, whether it's a switch to biofuels, of which their technical characteristics are not sufficient yet, from my understanding, all right, that's a hard sector. Maritime is working on it, and I've actually supervised student projects on this, where when you're looking at the various capacities and technologies that are being looked at, there is a trajectory there that it's I think is much more optimistic. If you're looking at trucking, so China is I think projected to get to 50% of EVs or car sales as EVs and hybrids by this year. So that trend is happening, and it takes time. You don't just suddenly flip from one to the other. It takes time. So it's
true. But like the global fleet's still only 1.5% as reported. And yes, the maritime shipping, what I'm looking at is the one I like is methanol, and ammonia is the other fuel I like. So there are technology vectors possible. I actually went to visit Marex to actually sort of talk to them about this, but we haven't done it yet on a large scale. Right? Most of the shipping that's out there is still conventional.
And another point with shipping is I think the statistic is something like 1/3 to 40% of global shipping is just fossil fuels.
Yeah, wipe that out. In fact, the calculations I've done is you take that out. If we don't use fossil fuels anymore, then we won't need that tanker fleet. I think it's 34%, something like that. Take it away, and what's left is what we do. But the other thing too is our just-in-time supply grid is really complicated, and there's a lot of stuff that's based on the idea of energy is really cheap and we can send stuff all over the world, and how many of the actions that we're actually sort of looking at are necessary. And like could we actually do things better where we build things that are based on quality, not based on making money as fast as possible in a disposable culture. So that number of if we had less transport actions of higher quality, we could shrink that down a lot more. But that really sort of, we've got to restructure our manufacturing, restructure what we want. That's actually a different conversation. I actually just worked on replacing the existing system as it is, and went for that. And the technologies I used an IEA prediction of what might be like a battery market projection for 2050, and they have for storage and for transport, and they had a whole series of them, like solid state batteries, LFP, redox, vanadium redox, but they all have the percentages there. So I've just projected my numbers into that. Now when we get there, obviously reality will be different. But what I'm trying to do is put on the ground a starting point of how much materials we would need if we were to go that direction. And as far as I can tell, no one's really done that the same way. Like there was even basic things like how many cars were there in the global transport fleet? Like that, I couldn't find that number. Like lots of people have done it. Lots of studies have done it for, say, the United States or Europe or China, but no one has summed the whole world together that I could find. The next question was, well, what distance did each of these vehicles of each class travel? And again, the United States actually sort of had some of that information, but it was pretty slim pickings elsewhere. So, number of vehicles and what physical actions or what they do over a calendar year, that tells us how many batteries are in operation and how much charging capacity would be needed from the grid. And so it was a series of calculations, and we went through each of the industrial systems that were mapped out for the year 2018. If we were to take out oil, gas, and coal for all our industrial systems and replace them with something else, and especially with like electricity generation, I didn't include manufacture. This is straight consumption of electricity. And so, this is how I came about these numbers. What ended up happening, though, was the discussion around the buffer. I got into a lot of trouble with that. As it was my initial assessment, I just went with what net zero suggested, which was 5 to 7 hours. But in a review, I was taken to task because in net zero, they did a simulation across a number of days. In net zero, they had during the night, most of the power was still thermal power generation. Right, and so it was a real pants down moment in front of a review panel. That says that you've got this badly wrong, and so I had to go away and reassess everything, and here we are. And so at the time, I came up with a guesstimate of 28 days, but since then I have now 4 estimates. So it depends on what buffer you support. If you support 6 hours, I've got data for that, and so on. But now I've actually got empirical data, and a study done in Hawaii that came back as 28.8 days. Is the size, and when it goes below the level, it goes across across that average line for a couple of months over winter. So not only do you have to store that power, but you have to store it for a couple of 100 days in some cases. And that's just the conclusion I came to. I understand that no one else agrees with me, and for that reason, people say, yeah. But I understand that, but I stand by my numbers for the reasons of the path that I've actually sort of gone through to actually work them out. And my conclusion is we should just look at a different energy system. Not that we're doomed, not that we're running out of minerals. We should just do something else, because human innovation is a thing.
Yeah, I guess, as I say, I don't think we need the degree of storage and other things there that you're sort of putting in your extreme model, because many of the work I've seen out there, but as I've said, designing energy systems is not my area. Looking at the resources required for them certainly is.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
But when I've seen it, and whether it's Mark Jacobson, whether it's many others out there that have actually looked at trying to model global energy systems, and including looking at detailed weather patterns. I've seen work out there, whether done at PhD level, where people have actually looked at 30-year detailed records and actually done the calculations. So and you don't need the degree of storage that you're saying we need, and so therefore that vastly reduces what that means in terms of mining and mineral requirements. But the other point, which I think we haven't got onto yet, and it sort of comes back to some of the questions around the impacts of mining as well, is global mining is about probably a third, 40% coal.
Yeah,
right?
Something like that.
Now, once you delete that, that's huge. That's a massive sort of decrease in the extent of mining. Now, if you go through the numbers, and I've got some work in progress on this that I'll hopefully get out the door soon. But if you're looking at lithium, we're going from, let's just round it off to 100,000 tons recently. I think 2023 is probably higher than that, but it's something of that magnitude. Multiply that by 10, you get to 1 million. Let's be generous and multiply that by 100 and get to 10 million tons of lithium per year by 2050. And certainly some of the different models, whether it's IEA and others, are not far from that. They tend to be closer to about 1.5 to 2 million tons per year of lithium. But that's 1%, ore grade, roughly speaking. And I'm using that as an equivalent to sort of account for the salars as well, because you've got lithium coming out of the brines and salt lake systems, or salars as they're called in South America. So if you use that as a crude approximation, then in other words, you've got to mine roughly 100 tons of material plus waste rock in order to get that. And if you scale that up, you're lucky if you can get to, let's say, 1 billion tons, whereas certainly in coal mining, you're talking tens and tens of billions of tons per year. Now, that's just lithium. Let's add up rare earths. You're dealing with the same sort of numbers, probably less actually, given the grades and the numbers involved. Now, looking at the increase in nickel, you're depending on the magnitude of increase in nickel, and you go through all of these numbers, the increase in mining we need for metals and specific minerals, nowhere near what we're removing from the system in terms of coal. So from a global planetary point of view, we're actually better off. And there's a recent paper by some academics out of Leiden that have shown this as well, right? In a sort of, I suppose, more back of the envelope calculation as an approach, but the numbers are still pretty good, all right? So I think that's some of the challenges and when we're looking at it, and I think that's where whether you're looking at the just transition, as people often call it, whether it's all the coal fields, we need to work out how to transition those coal fields, not just sort of physically in terms of the mine rehabilitation and so on, but socially for all those workers and those communities. That requires a huge amount of work. All right. So there's all sorts of other issues that are out there that people are certainly aware of and working on. All right. Now, one of the things that we're seeing, and we've seen this in Australia, is former mine pits can be actually used for pumped hydro storage. Right, you put large solar arrays over the old tailings dam. This is the Kidston project up in Queensland, right? And you've got a great battery, right? So I think there's all sorts of ideas out there, right? So when we're looking at it, I think and when you sort of start putting that together, I'm confident, I'm optimistic. I'm not certainly. I don't see it's insurmountable at all.
So my approach for that would be to take your number of pits in Australia. And if we were to use all of them, if we were to fill them up full of water, what capacity of power could they store versus, and if that all worked out, how much will we need? And that's my approach to that. I haven't actually done that.
That's been done. ANU did that work about 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, there you go. I haven't actually sort of looked at that, but that's how I'd approach that. As in, if we were to use pumped hydro storage and if we were to use the pits, great idea. Let's look at the numbers in terms of what that would deliver. Have you given some thought about what happens when we take out coal and replace it? What I'm getting at is most of coal consumption at the moment is associated with manufacture, not just the burning of coal for electricity, but metallurgical coal to actually produce steel. So if we take coal away, but we still want to produce the same amount of steel, what are the options to do that? And what's the magnitude of that? And have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, it's not an area I've worked in, but I've certainly seen some of the work out there that looks at that. Now, whether it's Sweden, people, the whole sort of focus on green steel is using hydrogen technology.
Yeah, right? It's great.
And we know it works. It's a matter of getting the economics and where you get the hydrogen from. Right?
Yeah.
That's always one of the questions. I'll come back to that in a second. But we know it works. I mean, BHP built their hot briquetted iron plant over 20 years ago, spent several billion, had some very serious accidents and killed some workers, and was uneconomic. And so they shut the whole thing down. Right. Rio Tinto at the same time built their high smelt plant, which they're now going back to and I think restarting in Kwinana, if I remember correctly from the recent news. So I think there's options there for that. All right. Now, what it comes down to is the hydrogen and then the economics of producing that hydrogen. Now, one of the questions that people then come back to is like, well, do we have enough iridium and of the different platinum group elements that are used as the catalysts for making hydrogen? And as someone who's published an enormous number of papers on platinum over the years, the answer is yes. Right. And we know that when you're looking at the global platinum industry, platinum is amongst some of the most recycled metals, the platinum group elements, I should say. All right. Because most of the way that we use platinum group elements in catalysts, in petroleum refining or other sectors as catalysts, they are recycled because it's actually in their interest to do it economically. All right. So I think the question then becomes is what's the cost of hydrogen technology to do that? Now, it's not something I follow in great detail, but certainly it seems to me that when you're looking at the reality on the ground, you're not seeing the cost reductions in green hydrogen production to anywhere near the same extent. We're seeing the reductions in the costs of batteries, of EVs, of solar panels and wind turbines and so on. All right. So if you're looking at your industrial learning curves, it's not happening for hydrogen yet. Now, certainly for a country like Australia, that has huge implications because at the moment, a lot of the iron ore we export is not as ideally suited to green steel using hydrogen compared to, say, magnetite, because a lot of the ore we export is goethite, it's hematite rich, especially. It's different types of mineralogy. Now, Australia's got a huge amount of magnetite. We've never worried about it typically because it hasn't been preferred compared to, say, hematite or goethite. So I think there's options there. And like we've seen before, we've seen it in cycles for mining, we've seen it in cycles for different technologies as they emerge. When becomes that tipping point that the costs really start to go down, or that people are prepared to pay the higher price to make that stuff happen. So I think there's certainly options out there for steel, as there are for aluminium and other sectors as well. Right. So I think there's, again, I'm not pessimistic in that front. I think we have to be realistic about the challenges, and the challenges are really around the costs of hydrogen technology, but certainly the material basis for it is certainly not the problem.
So this is not work I've done yet. This was something I was actually interested to see if you've looked at this, but where I was approaching with that, with what's in a hydrogen fuel cell, I could only get an estimate for platinum at the time, and yes, we don't have a platinum problem, right? That's not on the list of things that are a problem, but I was looking at hydrogen in terms of, well, at the moment we make hydrogen with gas. Like I like the hybrid system in Sweden, where they make steel in a hydrogen atmosphere. And I actually included that in my paper and this is what we should do. But to get the hydrogen, well, you've got to make the hydrogen. We're not going to use gas anymore. So if we go through electrolysis, when I did the study, at the time they were saying 55 kilowatt hours for a kilogram. I use 50 to be conservative. As with new technology sort of comes in, but then you've got to compress it into a tank, and there's handling a few other things. So you end up spending about 57 kilowatt hours for every kilogram of hydrogen, right? So that's just to produce the hydrogen. So how much hydrogen would we need to produce the steel at the same quantities using the hybrid system if China was to take this on? And that's the basis of the study. Not that we can't do it. It's just like, what quantities are we talking about? And I was sort of debating whether that was actually a study worth doing or not. But anyway, so
I think there are people looking at exactly that, because when you're looking at the industry, it's in the steel industry's interest. If you took Australia, and these are pretty close to the real numbers, Australia exports close to a billion tons of iron ore per year. Rolls off the tongue, 1 billion tons per year. And yet we banned iron ore exports in 1938 when we thought we only had 250 million tons in reserves. Right. So, and we've got 150 billion tons of good quality iron ore still left, right? But so when you're looking at it, and that gets us something of the order of 150 billion dollars worth of export revenue, right? Now that'll go up and down a tiny bit, but it's certainly that magnitude, right? Now, if we were to convert that through to green steel, and this is analyses that have been done by Saul Griffith and Tim Buckley and many others. And we could do similar numbers for things like aluminium and others, but if we converted all of that iron ore to green steel, instead of 100 to 150 billion, we'd be getting several hundred billion. All right. So I think it's in Australia's interest, obviously, to do that, and that goes further down the manufacturing chain. We add more value in Australia. So, and it'll be the same. You could do the same sort of analysis, and people have with bauxite to alumina to aluminium. As it is for other metals as well. So I think there's good motivation for people doing that, but that's a big scale. That's certainly I don't think we disagree on the fact that that's a huge scale and change. But again, when you're looking at different countries around the world, we've moved from blast furnace technology through to electric arc furnace technology. These systems do change over time, and sometimes we need to make them change more rapidly. 1941 in America would be a great example after the invasion or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, everything changed extremely quickly because it just had to. Same with the UK in 1939 when World War II started. Suddenly, the UK had to radically change. And so David Peck's work showed that it took 12 months to adjust supply chains and make things more efficient and drop use by 50% for various things and so on. So, not to downplay the challenge at all, not to downplay that challenge at all, right? But there are people working on it, and there are people who have there are solutions there. The challenge is whether it's the policy, whether it's the economics, but certainly the material basis for it. That's not the problem.
No, I was looking at the energy required. So I was looking at replacing the Chinese system. Like what was China doing? And if we were to go convince them to do things differently, what would that look like? As for Australian mining, I'm actually have come to the conclusion a long time ago that the Australian administration is not being very smart about managing its own resource stewardship in terms of Australian interests. How they do mining.
On that we agree.
It's just like it's like I can see future historians looking back at these couple of hundred years and says, "You guys are idiots." Yeah, no. So the whole knockout coal. What does coal really do for manufacture? So I've looked at a few studies and that's been done so far, and again, the assumptions were pretty vague in a top-down sort of way. So I was actually thinking doing a bottom-up study. Was actually done within the in the manufacturing sector. How much heat had to hit the ground, what temperature, and if we were to deliver that with hydrogen, what would our footprint be? So that is actually something that I have not done yet. So I actually don't know what the answer is. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's fine. Like as I said, there's some areas where we've still got a long way to go. Aviation would be one. Right?
Yeah.
Things like steel, aluminium, we can see our ways forward on that. It's a matter of whether it's getting the costs of electrolyzers down, working out how to what renewable energy and where, and I think this is the other problem that we face globally is, and I think this is probably where we have an overlap of agreement perhaps as well, is that too often it's left to the market to decide. Where should the next lithium mine be? Mining company one says over here. Mining company two says, no, pick me. All right. So rather than actually a strategic think about, well, where is places that are off limits? Where are places that are off limits? Where are places that are potentially suitable? And geographically, politically, environmentally, economically, let's come up with a strategic plan to say, well, actually, rather than keep trying to pick places that are going to be opposed, and often communities have good legitimate reasons to oppose projects, whether it's one argument I've heard for the Jadar project in Serbia, for example, is around the Neolithic heritage that exists in that area. Right? In Australia, we'd see Indigenous heritage and we'd blow it up because it's $50 million worth of iron ore. Right? Now, you wouldn't be able to get away with that in Europe, right? But in Australia, that's done on a near daily basis, whether it's the mining sector, the petroleum sector, or whatever. Now, so I think so. Communities sometimes, when they say they don't want mining, those reasons have to be respected.
Yeah.
Right. Right now, that means we say, right, well, if we can't build it over there, then we have to look somewhere else. But I think part of the problem is that we don't have this sort of strategic vision of actually mapping that out and saying, actually, where it does make sense to look at building potential mines, or do we go back and say, let's expand existing ones? Right, that's often much quicker generally than, say, trying to build new ones. Right. Rather than just leaving it up to the market to decide, well, we want projects, X, M and K to proceed, rather than actually thinking about where, when, where, why, how, we're more strategic about how we approach that. I think that I see as a real problem.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been looking at is if we were to decarbonize mining, like that, to me, there is a path forward now, whereas a couple of years ago, I didn't really understand what that would be, but I understand what it could be now. But one of the things I was looking at, and this is work that we've both done. Well, really, I did a bit of it, and I just referred to your work. Grades declining. What I also picked up on was mineral grind size is declining. The grains are getting much, much finer. Now, the problem with that is energy costs are going up, right? So if grade declines, you've got to shift more ore per unit of metal. But if the grind size declines, you've got to grind to a much finer size. And also, when you're starting to break down other mineral grains, like if you've got magnetite in your ore and you've got to break that grain size down, then your grinding costs go up. This is back in the days when I was looking at the energy consumption of grinding. Now, the Hooke energy curve shows an exponential relationship. As you go finer, you've got to put more energy in. So costs are going up. Now, the problem I have is this. The way the mining industry comes together is we're going to have a project on the ground. Here is a mine, this is what's in it. A deposit, here's what's in it. It has this economic value, and these are the costs of getting it out. It's just a cost. It's a cost return calculation. if we are starting to look at a massive amount, like when we get to the really, really fine grained stuff and it's low grade, right, it's really disseminated, there's a jump where a lot of it's actually sort of a couple of microns. That's really, really small. So we're talking about like a much, much greater amount of energy. The problem is if we take fossil fuels away, but now we've got to deliver that energy with non-fossil fuel systems, right? That is a discussion I haven't really sort of seen done very well. Like what are the implications of that, especially if we now need a lot of extra metals to actually, because we've got to retool society. We've got to take down our existing fossil fuel system and put a new system in its place. That will require a lot of resources. Have you seen anything like that?
I've certainly seen some people go look at parts of that system, but material return on material invested is the sort of concept I've seen people put out there. But it's more complex than that. And actually, I think some ways we can simplify it. I've seen people say, well, rather than constantly keep grinding finer all the time, sometimes actually, redesigning a flow sheet. So you actually have a coarse grind initially and separate things out and then go to hydrometallurgy rather than flotation.
Yeah, leaching.
Right? So, yeah, so there are different flow sheets that we can develop, and this is part of whether it's life cycle assessment thinking. How can we change the nature of that curve, right? Because it's as grades decline, yes, not only just as grades decline that the energy costs go up, but we know typically speaking with a lot of deposits, and it varies depending on which metal we're talking about. Some much more so than others, like lead zinc, for example, right? But yeah, typically as grades go lower, the refractory capacity or characteristics of that ore tend to go up, right? Which means it's more difficult to actually then extract out. So, and we've seen that, just in Australia, the move from Broken Hill to Mount Isa to MacArthur River, each generation got so much more complicated because of fine grain texture. Now, it took 40 years before Mount Isa Mines eventually developed the technology to process MacArthur River ore, but they got there, and there's all sorts of other issues associated with MacArthur River, but that's a whole nother story. All right, so I think I've certainly seen people look at a flow sheet and go, right, rather than just going down that pathway, that is not sustainable. We can't, that's going to, the capital cost of building that would be too big. The operating costs are obviously very significant when you factor in the energy required for grinding. So we need to go back to square one and redesign the flow sheet. And there's certainly good examples out there of that. And I've certainly seen some of the big engineering consultancies out there that have delivered projects on that basis. So now, as I say, I've seen it for individual projects. Even in my global studies that I've done with colleagues and PhD students and so on, trying to put, whether the degree of refractory mineralogy, that's difficult on every single deposit globally for whether it's copper, whether it's nickel or lead zinc or others. Then trying to put a flow sheet around every single deposit and how that might actually eventuate. Obviously, huge assumptions around all of that. So typically what we've always assumed is just let's just say assume copper. The vast majority is going to be flotation, some increase in, say, heap leach, for example. And what we're seeing in nickel is a huge rise, obviously, in the amount of laterite that's being processed, thanks to sort of what's happening in Indonesia and to a lesser extent the Philippines as well. But and again, the Indonesia was driven largely by whether it's Chinese investment, but especially Indonesian government policy that said, don't export raw ore, that's not allowed anymore. Yeah, and then you have to start actually downstream processing and only allowed to export refined metal. And so despite the naysayers, that's led to a huge surge in nickel mining in Indonesia. All right. And so it's also caused some unintended consequences, like a massive short-term spike in bauxite mining in Malaysia that caused lots of issues. Only lasted 2 years, but then it got shut down. But so I think there's lots of issues out there, and I think that's part of what we're seeing. Some companies are certainly more progressive in thinking about that and actually acknowledging what that really means. But certainly the traditional approach is not going to be able to get us there. So we need to start thinking more comprehensively around how we develop mines and what that means. And I think certainly some companies are much better, much further down the pathway for that. Definitely. A good example would be the extraction of scandium. All right, you've now got the Philippines at both of their high pressure acid leach projects at Taganito and Coral Bay. It's actually just Taganito, I think, that actually extracts scandium. But then you've also got scandium being extracted out of titanium operations in Quebec, so run by Rio Tinto. So I think people are starting to think about how to get more out of the different mining that we're already doing. All right, and I think certainly when we first started looking at indium well over 10 years ago, only a third of the zinc refineries around the world had an actual circuit to extract indium out of zinc concentrates. Right, and what we're seeing ever since then is that the amount of indium being recovered for every ton of zinc has almost doubled in that decade. So we're, and that accounts for the increase in indium that we're seeing globally in terms of increased production. It's doubled over that same time. So I think there's always lots of things to look at and think about, but certainly those types of things, it's a matter of understanding your energy source as you electrify mining, and there are fully electrified mines in operation now, in like the Borden mine in Ontario, I think it is, and others. And we've got electrified haul trucks are now being sold. So I think that the pathway is there, and I think we're starting to see a rapid rollout, and certainly just even the take up of renewable energy at mine sites is growing exponentially.
So,
Gentlemen,
yeah,
wow, you literally covered all the topics without me interfering. Congrats.
until now.
So I just have one more topic to go deeper into, actually as a question, but then we will take some questions from the audience because there's a lot of questions. Geopolitics and social factors.
Mm-hmm.
How do global power dynamics and local community concerns influence material supply? Are there practical ways to address these issues quickly, or are we stuck navigating a complicated web of competing interests? And I'm also referring to tariffs that are being announced and, geopolitical power games. This is really important aspect talking about materials and mining. So can you take 15 more minutes on this one and we'll go to the questions?
Sure. I see it as a horse race. On one hand, you've got the on-the-ground SLO issues. The communities are getting more and more sophisticated of actually sort of understanding the implications of what they're seeing. And so, look, we're not going to put up with this. You guys are dodgy. We're not going to accept this. And then you've got the other part of the horse race is you've got governments and administrations allowing increasingly dodgy things to be authorized, right? And so there's a few examples in Australia. Gavin, you'll probably know have these on hand. But I was at and so you on one hand you've got a pressure from the top down to do more mining and do it in a way where the people on the ground are irrelevant. As in, when a coal mine starts up in central Queensland, it's been sold off to the government of India, and they want like a little piece of India, and to hell with the Australian laws. But the people on the ground, we ain't allowing this, and so it's an arm wrestle that is becoming more and more sophisticated, and I don't think it's clear which way it's going to go, because people on the ground are now starting to collect information and data and understand this, and so we ain't going to put up with this.
I think the world's changed. The internet has, for all of its evils, the internet actually has made people more informed, all right? And it's easier to get news, and bad news travels much, much faster than good news. And I think we've known that. We've known that in PR, in marketing, in all sorts of things for decades, all right? For all sorts of different aspects of the way our world and societies work. So communities get the bad news really, really quickly.
Mm.
So what we need to be doing is actually documenting the good news much better and actually having the evidence behind it much more viscerally than what we've ever done before. It's why I call for radical transparency. Because if you think about Australia, we've probably had, if we think about mines, large-scale mines or modern mines since 1950, you're probably looking at, 1,000 odd, and there might be, multiple different open pits or different parts of that project. So you could probably expand that number out, but it's that sort of magnitude. Now, how many of those have we actually rehabilitated? How many of those have actually closed down permanently such that they're never going to open again? Right? And the answer would actually be very few.
Mm.
Now, when you say then of those very few, how many have we rehabilitated and come back to 20 years later and shown that, the rehabilitation has worked. It's been successful. We're not leaking pollution. There's no erosion risk. The tailings dams are stable, for example. All right. We've maybe got an ecosystem there, and we've actually got a thriving community. All right. It's exceptionally hard to find examples that tick off every single one of those criteria. All right. Now, there are examples where you can tick off some, but not all.
Mm.
All right. So that's the sort of studies that we need to be thinking about globally. All right. So we need to be demonstrating that, sure, as a mine, and mines, they can do progressive rehabilitation. They don't have to wait until the mine's finished. And so there is examples, whether it's a waste rock dump or a previously used tailings dam, or an old open cut that's no longer used, and maybe backfill that with tailings instead of building another tailings dam. And once that's filled, cover it over with waste rock and then revegetate. So you've actually got that, rehabilitated properly. So there are ways to deal with these things. And I think that's what we've got to start looking at, is making sure that we're documenting all of that, that there is good monitoring on that. Part of the problem is that some of the monitoring is done, isn't up to spec. Some of the examples, some of the best examples we have of rehabilitation in Australia would be the bauxite mines over in Western Australia. Now, the work that's been done there suggests that it's about 10 years to get to about 95% of the same ecological indicators. And people look at that and go, that's pretty good. And it is really good, compared to what we used to do, which was not much at all. The problem is, of course, we're taking out 500-year-old trees. Now, those 500-year-old trees are critical refugia, like places for whether it's small mammals and macroinvertebrates or insects and all sorts of things like that. So there are still changes to those ecosystems that are a result of what we do with mining. Now, overall, there's a lot of talk more recently around sort of nature positive mining. All right, because not only do we have the climate crisis, we also have a biodiversity crisis. Increasingly people would say we have a governance crisis. But nature positive mining means we should be restoring ecosystems and adding, more biodiversity out there, at a simplistic sort of way of explaining it than what was there before. All right, so that way we're getting a net addition, an overall net benefit. So great, let's work out how we can do that. What's the criteria? How do we assess all of that? All right. So I think that's all the solutions we need to be looking at. And so when we're thinking about it, rather than a community going, well, actually, hang on, no, we don't trust you because, look, you've done this polluting mine elsewhere, the company can go, well, yeah, we've mediated that, we've fixed it, we've rehabilitated it, and here's the evidence. All right. So I think, and that alone is not going to guarantee everything, because sometimes there's issues there, whether it's, cultural, and sometimes it may be noise or other issues as well. All right. Communities in a democracy, we have rights. Whether we like communities exercising those rights is another issue. All right. And certainly there's some governments that do ride over communities many times, Indigenous and others. So I think that's all the sort of the breadth of all of my experience has sort of led me to, is that we need radical transparency. How many companies actually release the annual stability assessments of their tailings dams globally? Some, but not a lot. All right. How many actually put aside money into some kind of fund to say, actually, we've got a fund set aside that's a perpetual fund, that the interest on that is then used to pay for monitoring and maintenance and things like that. Nowhere in the world has a system like that, as far as I know. All right. So if we want to get communities on side, let's work out how to make all of these types of things happen. So I think that's how we deal with the social side. But within that, you've always got geopolitics, and it's and I think that and people think, oh, it's a new game. No, it's not. Geopolitics and resource politics has been around forever. Been around for centuries and millennia, really. It's just that we're in a completely new game in a way. Like with the extent of mining and the scale of that globally is obviously very, very different. So. And of course, that has issues. So I guess that's the problem at the moment, is how do we navigate that? And that's, our collective job is to work out how to best to do that.
And government seems to evolve faster than the people on the ground. That's another. We have to get to the point where communities on the ground are actually sort of see the mine as a good idea. They support the idea. We benefit from this. If we can get that paradigm going, in conjunction with, we are not going to be destroyed by allowing this to happen. Whereas at the moment, communities are often felt like they're left behind.
Yeah, and because historically that's what's happened, and I think and if we're not honest about that, then we're never going to solve the problem. So what do we do? How do we put things in place that are not reliant on a 25-year commitment from government? And there are examples. You can see it in different parts of the world, but where companies actually do put in place systems and processes. Like I remember seeing some research many, many years ago that looked at how environmental auditing and the regulation of the platinum industry was in Zimbabwe. And I remember looking at it and going, wow, that's actually better than what we have in Australia. So it's not just about, whether it's in Australia or, developing parts of the world or emerging economies. It's about the systems. It's about that governance and making sure that there is that interlocking sort of, connections between the technical side, the monitoring, the environmental monitoring, the actual design and performance of the mine, the governance criteria. One of the things that certainly I've seen when you're looking at some of the way that regulatory criteria are set up for mines, they don't use things like water quality criteria or air quality criteria. There are some mines in Australia that were exempt from meeting national air quality standards.
Yeah.
And then they're wondering why communities are not actually trusting the mining companies, because they say, well, you're allowed to pollute.
Yeah.
Legally allowed to pollute, and it's like, well, no, that shouldn't be the case. So we should be making sure that all of these things line up. And I remember, I've had some involvement many years ago with the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And one of the issues, one of the questions is, could an IRMA certified tailings dam collapse? Well, of course it could. You have to be honest about that. Same as when you fly. There's a theoretical possibility, and very, very, very low probability, of course, that you could have an accident, right? And yet we still fly, and it's still actually safer than driving or things like that. So I think when you're looking at it, when we looked at IRMA, a lot of that, the sort of the way that we approached it, and I think things have evolved a bit since then. But the basic logic was, you have to have community accept that the tailings dam is being monitored properly, that there's transparency around that, and that say for a tailings dam, for example, you need a community engagement plan or emergency response plan, things that you're supposed to have anyway, really. So a lot of it, I think, is making sure that all of these things line up, and we can hopefully get that debate changed around mining, and making sure that we are then making more sensible choices. But that's the sort of direction we have to head in.
Okay, now we are going to the questions. So we have Peter for Gavin. We're experiencing a significant increase in demand as the world decarbonizes. Reserve and resources are on one metric. Is the industry positioned to maintain a flow rate of minerals that can meet the rare rate of demand growth?
I think, well, my simple answer to that, I think, is broadly yes, but it does depend on which commodity, and then who controls it. The geopolitics of some elements, like rare earths, for example, are still very dominantly controlled by China. All right, so, but I think what we're seeing two different rare earth refineries being built in Australia. We're seeing other projects on the cards in Australia. We're seeing other projects globally. Part of the debate about Greenland, rather, ironically and perhaps tragically ironically, is its critical mineral resources. Despite the fact, the sort of proclamations that the US has now pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there's a rejection of climate science. They're still going after Greenland for whatever thing motivates them, but it's clear that critical minerals and the rare earth deposits there are part of that. I think the questions comes down to a lot of it, same old questions, like it's the governance, it's the transparency, all of these things. So yes, I think we do broadly. There can be variations depending on which commodity and which part of the world you're in. But yeah, I'm a firm believer in that.
Simon, what's your take?
So if we continue as existing demand, then yes, we're probably okay. If we do see a massive step change in retooling society, and do you think that's when the trouble starts? How big is that step change depends on whether we can actually maintain that flow rate or not, and how fast do we go through that transition.
Okay. So next question is from Martin. How do you view the continuing ore depletion, which necessitates more and more energy, land space, transportation, etc.?
I think I'd be careful with terms there. I wouldn't call it ore depletion, because it's not depletion, it's just ore grade is declining. Now, as I was sort of alluding to before as well, if we've actually demonstrated that we're rehabilitating mines, let's say we're using this concept of nature positive. So we've got a tailings dam area, or we've got let's say we've got a bauxite mine, we've mined the bauxite, we've restored the forest and returned that area to a good ecological state. I think that's reasonable. That's the sort of expectations. And I think the other thing too is that that's what communities have been told the industry will deliver. Certainly in Australia and many of the developed countries that have, I suppose, stronger environmental regulation. So a lot of these things come down to how you manage it, what the criteria are to be able to judge whether it's successful rehabilitation or safe operations while a mine is ongoing. And there are options there. And what we have to acknowledge is that, as grades decline, footprints go up. It's how we respond to that and manage that I think is the real question there.
Simon?
So yes, footprints will go up, agreement there. What also will happen is as grade declines and grind size declines, energy consumption will go up and costs will go up. If that continues, I think there'll come a point when the economics of mining will change and we won't be able to extract large quantities the way we like, as cheap as we like. Like we could be moving into an era where mining becomes more expensive. And if that's the case, do we reassess how much metal we need and why? And that, I think, is an evolution that's coming.
Thank you.
Just a quick response there as well. I've never seen anyone properly model that out to actually really work out when that point is. We tried starting to do it many years ago and we realized we couldn't.
Yeah,
it's a great question, but I don't think anyone's got an answer for that.
Yeah.
So again, Gavin, if you look at mining site, it looks like we are butchering our own home. What is wrong with Simon's nuclear proposal? Where you enable human growth with a fraction of resources requirement and without defecting our planet?
I've worked with Indigenous communities in Australia and elsewhere on uranium mining impacts, and there's huge issues there. But I'm always think that our best options are renewables, and looking at whether it's battery storage, other technologies that get us there. Right? I'm certainly not a big proponent of nuclear.
So what I'm prefacing there is not conventional nuclear, but the next generation along of nuclear of molten salt modular reactors. This is experimental technology, so so you've got risk profiles there. As it's technology that's 50 years old, but it's not allowed to be in operation. But if it does work, the fuel is actually a combination of thorium salt with a little bit of uranium, and we also have the capacity to run down these nuclear fuel stockpile. Anyway, but if we go that route, the footprint of the nuclear of that industry will be much smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than the conventional nuclear industry, and that's kind of the approach I would now like to go down. And the minerals, most of the time we're looking at there, these reactors have the complexity. I went to Copenhagen to actually a factory that's actually planning to produce these, and they'll go out the door in 2028. They have a complexity of a 3-bedroom kit home. A 40 megawatt system sits in the equivalent of a 40-foot shipping container. It's made mainly of steel with nickel alloys. Yes, there are some exotic components in it, but there's less of them. The fuel is a thorium fluoride salt, which are all waste products at the moment. So it's an entirely different approach and paradigm to this. If we do go this way, it means we can decentralize our industrial grid and we won't need the transmission grid at all. So we can actually shrink our material requirements in multiple directions at once. But it's experimental, not experimental. It's not accepted technology. It's at the moment it's trying to commercialize. And I've actually seen units that it's trying to commercialize, but it's not there yet, so it's risky.
And thorium itself is not an easy element to work with, so it's not as simple as that.
Simon Gavin, what's your view on mining extraction being a linear and in the longer run non-sustainable process? Shouldn't we, on basic principles, significantly reduce raw materials consumption to reduce or almost stop mining of virgin materials?
I'm happy to go first there if you like, Simon. But
yeah, sure.
There's many elements we don't have enough of in the system to recycle, as we're sort of alluding to or sort of talking through a bit earlier. Lithium would be one, rare earths would be another. Cobalt in batteries would be another example. There are some elements we actually don't use in a way that we can recycle. All right. Antimony would be one in fire retardants, and there are others. All right. Do we need to make sure we keep increasing our efforts on recycling in a simplistic sense? Absolutely. Do we need to make sure we make our materials and we use them more efficiently? So we design, and we've seen that in computers, we've seen it in elsewhere, where you design the actual technology so it uses less metals per kilowatt, per kilowatt hour, per phone call, however you want to measure that. So material efficiency, yes, we should be absolutely doing that, and companies are. Now, should we also be looking at other aspects, like right to repair? So instead of having to replace a whole phone, you replace the battery, you replace the screen, or things like that. So all of those things should be on the table, and certainly when you're looking at the EU framework and whether it's more advanced economies like Japan, the US, and elsewhere, they all are. Even Apple came out a while back and said they won't oppose right to repair anymore, which they used to do. So I think we need all of those things. And the extent to which we can sort of ramp up recycling does depend enormously on the different metals. Some are more easy to ramp up than others, like say copper, for example, and others we need to get more into our system first, so that eventually in coming years we'll get more flows of things like products becoming available for recycling.
Simon.
So our society, the way we are at the moment, consumes resources to the metrics of consumption. Like we consume them like they're reusable and we throw them away, and it's all about economic value in doing so. We've got to design a society where we've got to take the circular economy into our design culture. And if we can do that, we can actually sort of reduce what we're pulling out of the ground, and we can move more towards recycling from our waste. But our society is not geared that way at the moment. We've got to do a lot of work to actually sort of work how to do that.
Okay, going to the next one. Joseph Gantry. Why is no one challenging the underlying premise of CO2 reduction is necessary? This is a basis for all efforts to change the energy system and is based on flawed models that consistently overpredict the global temperatures. No one recognized that.
Because that is not true.
So there's a continuance. No one recognizes the benefits of warmer temperatures and faster plant growth. There is no cost-benefit analysis that is being examined or debated.
So
no, that is not worth answering. I'm sorry, that's climate denial argument. That is not worth answering.
Okay.
So we can actually also, so like it or not, fossil fuels are going. Like even if you don't agree with that premise, right? Fossil fuels are going, right? And we do need to phase them out and completely decarbonize the system. So,
next one. Ireland level. Gavin Simon, what are your thoughts on the potential of the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive on mining and recycling? I've heard claims this might have significant impact on particularly mining.
As someone who's been looking at sustainability reports for 25 years, it's I think it's great that they're actually being used and actually starting to be understood as the possible framework that can help. Now, the disclosures and all of the data that's required, the sort of stuff that companies do anyway. Whether it's energy, they pay the bills. Whether it's water, they have their pumps and they have to have their meters running. So a lot of the different aspects that are in corporate sustainability reporting are stuff that good companies are already doing anyway. All right. So I think what it's doing is really formalizing that process, and also just introducing more transparency into the system. And we're getting consistency. So when we're looking at whether it's companies or different mines, we can start to get the basically equivalent quality data. All right. So I think overall it should be of benefit. Some companies may have to lift their game a bit, but for the most part, I think a lot of the better companies are already there.
So agreed. But I would also add that the sustainability metrics that are being reported will probably have to become more sophisticated, and we would have to actually sort of evolve our society to use what's been reported more effectively. So what's been done now, great, but I can see that whole field evolving to a whole new level of sophistication, and comes back again to systems thinking with what we do with that information.
Next one, Marcel Vester. Gavin, to summarize and oversimplify your remarks, current and future reserves, resources, production, stock volumes will keep pace with exponential growing demand caused by economic growth and transition plans for all nations, leaving aside ecologic and geopolitical challenges, how many generations do you look ahead?
That's a great question, but I think I've done work where we've looked out to 2100 in terms of what some of the numbers get and what sort of models you might put on that. Typically, at the moment, the world is very focused on 2050. That's the net zero target we have in terms of climate science. So, Indigenous communities I've worked with, make decisions about their communities often with respect to, say, 7 generations. Right? And as Simon was just saying, that's not the way our system works at the moment. So many of us are trying to get that change so we can actually get the sort of a more complex, sort of systems thinking and a better longer term view rather than a 3-year election cycle or a 2-year investment decision. So I think there's, these things are about the long term. So I think the premise of the question, I think, is a good one. The trouble becomes and I think, as we've talked about a lot, is how far forward can different models do. Now, when we're looking at some models, you look at the projection of renewable energy. The IEA have consistently got that wrong for many years. Only more recently have they started to much more radically sort of increase their uptake of renewable energy and EVs and batteries and so on. All right. So predicting the future is always really difficult. Like a line I always use, and it's a sort of probably somewhat glib, but I'd always much rather predict the past. I think you're much more likely to be accurate.
Simon?
So, again, it depends on what our system's going to be, right? If what technology network do we put in place to replace our fossil fuel system, and what's the material footprint requirements to do so? To me, I stand by my analysis that the approach with the green transition going forward isn't going to work to actually replace our existing system to the current capacity, let alone go forward for several generations. So we just need to do something else. But whatever that something else is, it's got to be examined in the context of material requirements. Where do we get them from? Ecological footprint. How do we manage that? And that we've got to be thinking. 2100 is probably a good target to look towards, at least, and actually sort of like, can we manage things out to that far? I think 2050 is short.
Okay, next one. Regardless of demand numbers or supply trajectories, you both agree that massive amount of mining is going to be needed in next 20 to 30 years. What specific evolutions are needed in the mining industry ecosystem to make this expansion a reality and to mitigate widespread harm to communities and environment?
Mining will have to be different. It'll have to be done very, very different. Oh, sorry, Gav, you were talking? Yeah.
No, that's all right. I was just thinking. I'd remove the word massive there because I think overall, as we've sort of talked through earlier, the total amount of mining actually goes down over the next 25 years. Right? Once you remove coal from the system, that means we delete a third to 40% of our current mining. Right? And even allowing for increases in other minerals and so on, it's not going to replace that. Maybe by 2100, that might be a theoretical possibility. I don't know. I haven't looked that far ahead in that level of detail. But mining does have to be done differently. We have to be more transparent. We have to be, whether it's AI, whether it's the electrification of mining, whether it's designing mines different. One of the challenges is instead of just going the conventional open pit mine, maybe we have to push more to underground mines where the footprint's less. Right? One of the things that we did some work many years ago with one of my postdocs at the time, where we looked at the actual land area and we mapped that out for hundreds of mines around the world, right? And then related it back to things like the ore grades and all sorts of various characteristics. And so, but of course, your underground mines have a lower footprint. So there's some of the choices. But automation, and we're already seeing that. You're getting entire mines being conceived now in the Pilbara in Western Australia, like big new iron ore projects, which are fully automated, 100% renewable energy, and all electric. That was unthinkable 10 years ago. So I think mining has to be done differently, but it's not just the technology of mining and the design of mining, but it's also the way that mining interacts with governance, it interacts with communities, and making sure that we've got that environmental credentials around the fact that mining is operating within very low impacts, and that's all a tall order. That's not an easy challenge at all.
Simon?
So one of the changes that could happen, for example, when we have a mine on the ground at the moment, they think in terms of, right, we're going to do the mine, and all their environmental rehabilitation is to be examined when the mine closes, 20, 30 years later. One of the shifts could be if the environmental footprint remediation is done as we go. So at any given time, the footprint of the mine is actually managed. So it's not, at the moment, the mine site's a separate entity. What happens on that mine site? Yeah, we'd rather not talk to you about it. And the community has to extract information out of them the hard way. If we change how we did the environmental rehabilitation and we change our attitude towards it, I think it'd be a positive step forward. Also, when we knock out coal mining, when you mine in a coal mine, you're taking a massive proportion, like you're taking the whole seam, so you're producing it's bulk production. And when you're actually in a gold mine, you're down at like 0.5% of the ore mass after you've shifted everything around.
0.5% gold miners would love that. Yeah, I think you mean 0.5 grams per ton there, Simon.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I mean. Yeah, so apologies. Whoa! But we're talking about a tiny fraction of the mass. So what would be interesting is if we knocked out coal mining, what is the number of mine sites that would actually be shut down as a consequence of that versus the quantity involved? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Gavin? Do you know how many coal mines are in operation?
There'd be tens of thousands worldwide. I don't think I've ever seen an accurate number that I would trust.
Yeah, that you would trust. Yeah, I understand.
Okay, next one comes from Jadon Nunez. Do we have materials, energy, and stability needed to take on this challenge?
Well, materials is not the problem. Energy, I don't see as the problem either. Stability, but what sort of stability? You mean political stability? You mean
probably, yeah,
grid stability? I think we do. And despite the turbulence we're seeing at the moment, and it is going to get worse for a while. I grew up on Star Trek, and Gene Roddenberry, the founder of Star Trek, his whole philosophy to life was that the human condition always gets better. Now, what he would also acknowledge is that the world of Star Trek went through nuclear war, genetic wars. Every time, in the longer run, it came out better. It came out a better society until we eventually got the world of Star Trek. So I will be optimistic on that front because I think history does bear that out. But we go through bumps along the way, and I think that's the problem at the moment. And I think another question there is sort of saying, do we have the time, with respect to climate, for all of these types of things as well? And that's the big question at the moment. That I don't know the answer to that one either.
Simon.
So for me, my viewpoint, based on my analysis, materials in the conventional sense, no, we've got a bottleneck. Energy, yeah, again, we've got a bottleneck. So that has a change in direction. If we do that change in direction, I think we'll be okay. As for stability, at the moment, we've got a global just-in-time supply grid across 6 continents. And geopolitically, we're going through a phase of when in doubt, run about, scream and shout, wave your arms. So I can sort of see a situation where it would be very useful if we could decentralize, where each continent became more or less self-sufficient again. And so if we can shrink the size of our industrial system and become more self-resilient internally, and that would be a sensible way forward for all sorts of things. But that would require an evolution of our society that we haven't really thought about. I also think the time it will take to do this is far larger than what people realize. It will take a long time to actually sort of get this amount of industrialization on the ground and actually operate.
We're almost there, guys. Question from Matteo. What about hydrogen and helium mining as a solution for hydrogen economy?
That's an interesting one. Hydrogen, I'm assuming that's referring more to natural hydrogen, of which
I assume
theory there, but it's not. There's certainly no large reservoirs, etc., being able to proven around the world yet. It's sort of there's a lot of excitement about the potential for it, but it's certainly not there yet. Now, maybe it will get there, maybe not. I don't know. But the resource in the ground is one thing. Having the industrial system and the processes to actually then take advantage of it, that's a huge question, and that's something that I think the hydrogen economy hasn't worked out how to do yet. Helium, not quite so sure about. Like a lot of our helium at the moment is associated with petroleum, same as we get the vast majority of our sulfur flows out of as a petroleum byproduct. That's another thing we'd have to start to work out how to change. So I think there's issues there, but it's I think at the moment, I don't see them as being solutions we're likely to see in the near future.
Okay, Simon.
Basic agreement with everything Gavin just said. There's a lot of excitement. Hydrogen has been found in some rocks. I've got no numbers associated though with how big a play could actually come from this. And also, hydrogen is very difficult to work with because it's such a small molecule. We know how to store it in small quantities and transport it in small quantities, but in large quantities, there does seem to be issues with brittleness and leaking and all. There's a number of engineering innovations that have to be sort of brought to completion. They're in progress now, but they're not quite there yet. So as and helium, well, actually, no, I haven't really looked at helium either. So I don't. If they are solutions, I haven't looked at them.
Okay. So last question we're gonna take today comes from Martin again. Gavin, you said we are on the right track. However, we can all see that global energy consumption and CO2 emissions keep on rising every year. Shouldn't we critically reconsider the present energy transition and think of an alternative approach with much less mining and decreasing energy consumption?
One thing I'll say there is electrifying everything means less energy consumption.
Yeah.
And that's initially hard for people to get their head around, but energy efficiency, and it's the other thing we also should be thinking about, is actually energy demand and making sure we're dealing with, making sure our use of energy is efficient as possible. That aside for the moment, electrifying virtually everything, we know that whether it's vehicles, they're much more energy efficient, so you need less primary energy going into them to achieve the same outcome. Right. So overall, when you're looking at the total primary energy required once we electrify the inputs to our grids, our transport and so on, means actually less energy. So we're heading in that direction. Now, there's a lot of pundits out there at the moment that are predicting that this will be China's peak year of CO2 emissions. When you're looking at their investments in renewables and what they're doing with their electrification sort of agenda, that's probably the reality, is that we will see that happen, and that has obvious implications, but generally some good implications too globally. All right, so I'm an optimist on that front. Like, I think when you're looking at all the various trends that I've seen, emissions are still rising at the moment, but we are in a transition, and you don't just suddenly turn a tap and stop everything overnight. So I think it's making sure we understand that transition, the trajectory, all of that, which is of course what we're talking about throughout the last 2 and a bit hours.
Simon.
Right, so what Gavin's referring to there is an internal combustion engine has an efficiency anywhere between 21 to 38%, depending on what system you're looking at, whereas an equivalent electric propulsion system has an efficiency of the order of 73%. Right, so they are much more efficient, but oil going in has a very high calorific density as a fuel. So then you've got the system of, well, how do we generate that electricity some other way? So now we're talking to the energy return on energy invested debate. Now that has been corrupted by people disagreeing about what should go into that calculation. But it's lots of things got to balance out there. But in terms of efficiency of use, electric systems are much more efficient than internal combustion systems. Right, but when it comes to actually electrifying our whole system, right, or whatever it is we do after fossil fuels, whatever that is, we've got to pay the piper. We've got to have a full systems analysis of what physical actions we do, followed by how do we actually action those physical actions, and then what technology is behind that, and what resources are behind that. And so whatever we do, we have to, I call it pay the piper, but that's in operation, but we've got to build that system first, which will mean there'll be a short step of re-engineering, retooling, construction, and it's going to take time to phase some systems out and phase new systems in, and it's going to be messy as hell. But we've got to think in terms of matching reality versus plans.
Yeah. Okay, to wrap it up, you both have a few minutes for your final words.
Okay.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I say that because when I look at trends, whether it's on the energy side, whether it's on the technology side, and just thinking about the fact that a lot of people generally have goodwill. There's certainly some that you might say that don't, but most people do. I think we'll get there, and I think we'll get there because it is the right thing to do, right? And so, so when we're looking at it, we have the materials, we have the resources. There's lots of challenges, and we can't be go into that with our eyes wide shut. We have to go into these challenges with our eyes wide open, and we do need to do things differently. Whether it's mining, and whether it's mining in Europe, whether it's mining in Africa or Australia. So we have to do things differently. We have to do them better, right? Because otherwise we're just going to leave more messes behind, like we've historically done for many mines and so on in the past. So I'm optimistic. I'm very confident that we'll get there and we're on the right track. But yeah, don't underestimate the scale of the challenge ahead. But we're on the right trajectory, definitely.
Simon?
So I'm also optimistic for the future. Human innovation is a thing. I do think our current path, though, has its problems, and I'm pessimistic with regard to the effectiveness of wind and solar to be our primary energy systems going forward. There are solutions on the ground outside of that, though. Right, so I know we disagree. It comes down to the size of the needed buffer for wind and solar. And I know we disagree on that, but like I said, I stand by that analysis, and I may well be alone in that, but I still stand by it. But I'm optimistic for the future, as long as we understand that our society has got to change how it does things at a structural level.
Okay. Thank you so much for being my guests today. I'm proud of the way you took this challenge, and I'm proud of you how you presented everything and showed the world that this is possible. To actually have a conversation and still agree and disagree and maybe change your opinion, but also to show the world everything that they wanted to see. So, thank you for thoughtful perspectives and the analysis, and thank you our audience for being here. We've tackled some of the toughest questions in the energy transition, but this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for upcoming conversations where we'll dive deep into topics like scaling renewable energy, the future of hydrogen, and much more. Until then, keep exploring, questioning, and imagining a better future. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Awesome.
Thank